Welcome, ladies. We are glad to have you here tonight. This is Girl Talk Apologetics, and we're having a presentation on biblical archaeology. Just want to make sure you're in the right place. So I want to introduce our guest speaker, Ted Wright. You want to wave, Ted? Show people where you're at?
Howdy.
Okay. All right. So Ted Wright is founder and executive director of epicarcheology.org. He has a bachelor's degree in anthropology and archaeology from Mississippi State University and a master's degree in Christian apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary, where he served as a graduate research assistant to Dr. Norm Geisler, an apologetics legend. He's also the former executive and teaching director of crossexamine.org, which is, you may know, Frank Turek's apologetics ministry. And for over a decade, he has been a speaker on Christian apologetics as well as biblical archaeology all across North America and internationally, and has served as adjunct professor of apologetics at Southern Evangelical Seminary and Charlotte Christian College and Theological Seminary. He has participated in the excavation of the biblical site of Ai with ABR, which is the Associates for Biblical Research, and is currently working on an archaeological survey in eastern Turkey. He's appeared on TV and radio, including ABR's TV program Digging for Truth, CNN's mini-series on the historical Jesus called Finding Jesus, Faith, Fact, Forgery, and recently finished filming 4 segments on biblical artifacts that's coming out this fall on the History Channel on a series called Mysteries Unearthed. In his free time, Ted enjoys fly fishing, cycling, hiking, and mountain climbing. And today, Girl Talk Apologetics is delighted to welcome Ted Wright to talk to us about how archaeology demonstrates the historical reliability of the Bible and the existence of Jesus. Thank you for coming, Ted.
And thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I wish I had a more free time than I actually do to go fly fishing. It would be great. And hiking. But it's such a joy to be with you guys and ladies. I don't know if there's any guys here too, but it's really an honor. Thank you so much. I really was aware of the ministry for about a year or so, maybe a little bit over a year, and just impressed at the passion that you all have for truth and for apologetics and defending the faith. And what a great honor to come on board tonight to talk about a subject that I started studying 25 years ago and never would have believed that I'm still teaching it. And it's my enthusiasm. It has not waned a bit. In fact, it's probably gotten even more. So tonight we're going to be. Let me just forewarn you. It's going to be probably like drinking from a fire hydrant. There's a lot of information. There's so much information. When Ann reached out to me a while back, to ask me to, the subject, I said, well, you pick the area. What area do you want to talk in? So there's so much. We're going to kind of focus tonight on Jesus and the Gospels. And the New Testament, because that is really the crux of our faith, and how archaeology can help us understand that faith, and what is the relationship between archaeology and Jesus and the story of Jesus and the gospel and the resurrection. Those are the things we're going to explore tonight in detail. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share screen. All right, so tonight we're going to be looking at exploring archaeological evidence for the Bible. So the question I want to begin with is the foundation of Christianity. And this is sort of a rhetorical question. We have to begin somewhere. So I want to begin with a rhetorical question that I know that you know the answer to, and that is the foundation of Christianity. What is the foundation of Christianity? And of course, you know the answer to that. And the answer is the resurrection of Jesus. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ has not been risen, then we as Christians are still dead in our transgressions and sins. So the resurrection is foundational. Very, very important question. But of course, there are skeptics of the resurrection, skeptics of the New Testament. Understandably, if you think about it, what it is that we believe. I mean, I know many of you, and I know myself is included, and you may not be the case with yourself. I don't know if how long you've been a Christian. You have to, but for Christians, this is a familiar truth. But for non-Christians, you got to think about what we're asking people to believe. We're asking them to believe a man that lived 2,000 years ago, claimed to be the Son of God, and claimed to, heal people and rise from the dead. It's kind of I mean, to us, it's familiar, but to some other people, it sounds to be a little bit far fetched. So there are people who are obviously skeptical of it. And there's a lot of objections to the Christian message. One of the most recent ones that we see today is something called the Spider-Man fallacy. And I know that the ladies here at Girl Talk Apologetics have had Sean McDowell on, and I know Sean is a big Spider-Man fan. But something called the Spider-Man fallacy. What in the world is the Spider-Man fallacy? The Spider-Man fallacy, this is from gotquestions.org, is essentially an objection that you see a lot on the internet today. Essentially, what it says is in the future, archaeologists might find some old comic books, Spider-Man comic books, and within those comic books are certain facts that are true, such as New York being an actual city, or other in Chicago or whatever the city. We know that these cities exist. So the Spider-Man fallacy is based on that historical evidence. Archaeologists might wrongly conclude that Spider-Man must have actually existed too. And essentially, that's what they're saying with us as believers. That yeah, you might get some cities right. Yes, the Bible may get some things right, but we can't conclude, therefore, that Jesus existed or whatever. And so, again, this is called the Spider-Man fallacy. I actually wrote an article on my website. If you go to epicarcheology.org, the article addresses this, and I won't dive into it too deeply tonight, but I want to give you sort of a summary of what some of the problems with this fallacy is, the Spider-Man fallacy. The first thing it commits is the straw man fallacy. In other words, they set up a weaker argument than actually we're giving, and then it tries to blow away that argument. The second thing it commits is something that I call the fallacy of genre. It confuses comic book genre with actual historical text. And then finally, they have a very misconstrued understanding of historiography, in which historians and scholars deal with something called primary sources, which we're going to look at tonight. Primary sources are really the difference. No real serious scholar uses comic books as primary sources for historical data. And then another thing, this word here is used by several of my colleagues. It's a great word. It's called verisimilitude. And it simply means there's a one-to-one correspondence between what we read and what we actually find in the ground. So verisimilitude is a very important concept. Just a little note on the fallacy of genre here. Again, it's a confusion or a conflation of actual historical sources with modern fantasy fiction genre. So in other words, we know the source of Peter Parker and his alter ego, Spider-Man. We can trace that with a high degree of certainty to the writer Stan Lee and the comic book artist Stan Ditko in 1962. And I think I got that right. Some of the comic book nerds will probably correct me if I got it wrong. But the same is also true of one of my personal favorite characters, fictional characters, and that's Dr. Henry Indiana Jones, Dr. Jones, of course, someone we're all familiar with. But we know that he originated in the mind of the writer and producer George Lucas. So again, the Spider-Man fallacy commits this fallacy of genres because no serious scholar actually uses comic books as primary sources because they know they're fantasy. And then, of course, a misconstrued understanding of historiography and archaeology. So if you want to know more about this, you just go to our website, go to epicarcheology.org and click on blog, and the article will pop up, and we get into it a little bit deeper. But of course, there's still skepticism about Jesus, and perhaps I'm not sure if he's still debating today, but Richard Carrier, who is considers himself, I think he still does, a Jesus mythicist, essentially says this, among many other things. He says the Gospels generally afford us no evidence for discerning a historical Jesus, and that most of what Christians, or that is early Christians, wrote were lies. We should approach, Carrier says, everything they wrote with distrust. Elsewhere, Carrier noted that the New Testament book of Acts, reliability for demonstrating the historicity of Jesus is essentially non-existent. And again, he is sort of on the far extreme in scholarship. Not all scholars hold to his view, but just to kind of give you on the really far extreme, there are still people, and there are even people on the internet today who say, well, we don't even know if Jesus existed. And this is just complete lunacy, in my opinion. So the resurrection is a question of history because it did take place 2,000 years ago. But where do we learn about the resurrection? What primary source do we learn about the resurrection? And the primary source that we learn about the resurrection, not the only source, but one of the main sources for our knowledge of the resurrection is the New Testament. So the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and of course the epistles, and specifically the book of Acts. So this raises the question in which archaeology can bear on, and that is, how do we know the past? How do we know the past? It's a vitally important question in establishing the relationship between archaeology and historical reality and what we can know of the past. So here's how we know the past. Historians know the past through something we call primary sources. And there are basically three primary sources. And here they are. On the left, we have eyewitnesses. Someone lived through an event, they saw that event, and they were contemporary with that event. Then that person records either for themselves or for their city or for their state or for their nation. They record that event on some other historical inscription, whether it's inscribed on stone or papyrus or parchment or whatever the case may be. So that leads us to the second source of primary source, which are historical records. Now, this is a whole another rabbit trail that we're not going to go too far into tonight. But just to let you know, we could spend a lot of time just on historical sources, and there are other scholars that do that. We're going to focus tonight primarily on archaeology. We will touch on historical inscriptions, but with historical inscriptions, what we'd really like to have as historians and archaeologists is we'd really like to have early sources. So in other words, a source, if not written by the eyewitness, then during the time of the eyewitness person who supposedly saw said event. And then we'd like to have multiple sources, so multiple attestations. So early attestation, multiple attestation, and another thing called enemy attestation. So in other words, the same event written from a different perspective. So for example, if you have two nations going to war, and one side said we won, the other side said they won, but they both agree that there was a war that happened on a certain date, then we know that it's a high degree of certainty that that war probably took place. Hopefully that makes sense. So with historical sources, again, we want early attestation, multiple attestation, and enemy attestation. And then the third thing is archaeological evidence. And the archaeology has different functions with historical sources. In fact, there's a big debate. Well, I would say debate. There is a lot of disagreement and discussion among scholars, historical scholars, as well as archaeologists, over the relationship between historical sources and archaeological evidence. But we're going to focus on archaeological evidence. And what is archaeology? Of course, we all know who this guy is, Dr. Jones, Dr. Henry Jones. But archaeology is essentially an investigation of the past through the scientific analysis of artifacts left behind by past human cultures. Archaeology, again, is a study of the past through artifacts. And an artifact is anything that's been made or modified by a human being. It could be a wall, it could be an embankment, it could be an arrowhead, it could be a piece of pottery, it could be a city, it could be any number of things. This happens to be a photograph of the warehouse of many of the amphora that were discovered in the Roman city of Pompeii that was destroyed by Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. These are artifacts, and they are perfectly preserved there in Naples, Italy. And so the question then becomes, what is the relationship between archaeology and history? To kind of show you this distinction here. Whereas archaeology is a study of the past by looking at the material remains, History is a study of the past using written records. So some material remains may be pottery or whatever the case may be. This includes the recovery, the cataloging, and the analyzing and the interpretation of artifacts. So, as such, I would say, and I think all scholars would agree with this, that archaeology is an auxiliary science of history. So, historians like to find artifacts that help them to understand the historical text they're reading. And likewise, archaeologists like to find historical texts that give illumination to their discovery. So, history is an investigation of the past using written records or text, and they could be any number of things. Ostraka, which is a piece of pottery with writing on it, engraved tablets, manuscripts, temple walls, palace walls, something called a stela, which looks like a giant tombstone with writing on it, et cetera, et cetera. So you get the idea here. Three functions of archaeology before we move ahead. Archaeology can clarify the text, it can illuminate the text, and it can also affirm the historical basis of the text. And there's whole examples that I could give, and we could go on so many rabbit trails with this, but we don't have time. But so let me give you an example, a real quick example of how this works. Eyewitnesses, the primary sources. So again, just to review, it's pretty easy to remember. There are only three primary sources: eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological evidence. So my grandfather, I grew up in the Deep South. And my grandfather was from a little town in Mississippi called Coldwater, Mississippi. That's the name of the town. I'm not making it up. And I remember as a kid, when I was a young 7, 8, 9 years old, our family would go to visit my grandparents during Thanksgiving, and my grandfather would inevitably tell us old war stories around the fireplace. And I had these fond memories of my grandfather telling these war stories, and I heard all these stories, and it never did click with me exactly what the war was until I got older. And then I was like, eureka. I mean, my grandfather was actually in D-Day. And when he passed away quite a few years ago, my grandmother gave me all of his old photographs and the book that he had while he was over in England during World War II. So my grandfather was an eyewitness to D-Day, June 6, 1944. And that's my grandfather. When I saw him, he didn't look as young. He was probably in his 20s. I think he was like 24, 23, 24 years old. This is in England. And these are all the old photographs. And on the back of the photographs, the reason why I know what these are is because he wrote on the back of the photographs. So these are the photographs of the U.S. Naval Headquarters in England. The one on the top left is him. He's standing on the top left. This is some of his guys he trained with. And then this is the landing barge. So if you ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, you know that boat that landed on the beach where the boat dropped and the guys got out? My grandfather drove one of those boats on D-Day, June 6, 1944. This is a photograph of the Navy dockyard where they were painting the boats, getting ready for the D-Day invasion. While he was there, they were doing patrols out across the English Channel, and they captured a German torpedo boat from the Kriegsmarine, and they snapped a picture. He snapped a picture. He had his camera with him of a captured German sailor on a German torpedo boat. And the reason I know that is because on the back of the photograph. And then, of course, he wrote down some of the things that he saw, and he wrote the dates: March 28th, 1944, 5:20 a.m. And you may not be able to read that, but essentially he says that it's really hot and that the Sunday, May 27th, 2 a.m. Got pretty darn hot in the harbor. Raids are hell. And what he's talking about there are the German Luftwaffe was still strafing the harbors there in England, and he's writing this down. So again, we have an eyewitness, we have now historical records, and he has this entry here, which gives us the date of where he was and what he was doing on June 6th. So June 5th, 2 a.m. till June 6th, 6:33 a.m., 28 of the most miserable hours I ever spent. And then he talks about how basically they made the trip from Portland, England to France Beach, and our 50-foot barges. Sea was rough as could be, wet and cold entire trip, 1944. So here is the entry of my grandfather at D-Day. This is a historical record. So let's go back to the archaeological. And this is not; these are not my grandfather's pictures, but this is what he would have seen when they landed. So the third thing with the primary sources is archaeological evidence. And you can go today in France and find German positions and thousands of Allied soldiers buried on the slopes of France. What about the New Testament? The New Testament claims to be written by eyewitnesses, and so we can no longer go and we can't interview Mark or Matthew or Luke, or we can't go and talk to them. But so what we have left are historical records, and we have early historical records. We have this is one of the earliest ones. To my knowledge, I think this is still considered to be one of the earliest fragments of the New Testament. It's called the John Rylands fragment. It dates to the possibly early second century. I know there's still some debate about this, but it's called P52, and it was discovered in Egypt in a dump in the desert called Oxyrhynchus by Grenfell and Hunt, two scholars looking at that. Basically, this dump site in Egypt contained these incredible like papyrus manuscripts that were preserved, and they found many fragments of the New Testament. And this one is John 18, where Jesus is talking to Pontius Pilate. And so the fragment, the picture that you're seeing there is actually one fragment, and on the left, called the recto, is actually what's called the front, and then the flip it over, the verso, is the back of it. And essentially, it's John 18. It's where Pilate has Jesus on trial, and he asks him, "What is truth?" That's what the fragment says. It's really awesome. Another fragment from Oxyrhynchus is called P1. It's in a codex form. It's the Gospel of Matthew 1, and then also it gives you the verses there. And it was again discovered by Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt in Egypt back in the late 1800s. So I think I got this right. I know this number changes. It's been a while since I made these slides, but the number currently of New Testament Greek manuscripts stands today at about around 6,000, so just under 6,000. Non-Greek manuscripts, Armenian, Latin, etc., number to 18,000, bringing the total number of manuscripts somewhere on the ballpark of around 24,000 manuscripts. This is from, and there are two organizations that I know of that actually do the work on manuscript counting. This one is in Munster, Germany, called the Institute for the Study of New Testament Textual Research. The other one is a great website that I want to tell you about, and it's all free online. This is called the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, and you can actually go. They are currently documenting manuscripts that are found in libraries around the world. This is the work of Dr. Daniel Wallace at Dallas Theological Seminary and his New Testament Greek doctoral students, and now many other scholars are involved. But essentially, they are in the process of counting manuscripts, and you can actually go on the website and look at in close-up detail a lot of these This is actually a screenshot from the website that you can go and look at their digital manuscript collection. So anybody can go to see the manuscript sources for the New Testament. Dr. Wallace says, he said this a few years ago, he says, when it comes to manuscript evidence, ours is not a lack of evidence, but an embarrassment of riches in biblical manuscripts. So it's not that we are following something that is just completely made up. We have and new manuscripts are coming to light, and they're earlier, and there are many of the manuscripts. So we have a very strong manuscript tradition, and I would encourage you to check out the work of Dr. Daniel Wallace in this regard. Remember, we talked about historical sources, and we want multiple attestation, enemy attestation, and we'd like to have early attestation. So the fact of the matter is, there was a historian that we have quite a few actually early sources that date to the time of the New Testament, and one of these is a Roman. Well, technically, he was a Jewish military commander who was actually captured by the Romans in northern Israel and Galilee, and he ended up kind of defecting over to the Roman side. Many of the Jews in the first century considered Josephus a traitor, and he kind of was actually. But he lived in Rome for quite a while, but he had a front row seat to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD by Titus and Vespasian. So he he's a first century source, secular source, in which he's saying basically the same thing the New Testament is saying. Here are historical facts about Jesus just from Josephus. There are 10. These are outlined by Gary Habermas in his book, The Historical Jesus. Jesus was known as a wise and virtuous man. He had many disciples, both Jews and Gentiles. Pilate condemned Jesus to die. He was executed by crucifixion. This is again, first century source, not the New Testament, but an independent source telling us that Jesus lived, he existed, he was crucified. His disciples reported that he rose from the dead. Again, the claim of resurrection. He appeared to them on the third day. So this knowledge, the knowledge of the resurrected Jesus, was so great that the Roman historian Josephus recorded it. Even if he didn't believe it, he's saying the disciples are going around saying he rose from the dead. And then number 7, his disciples continued to proclaim his teaching, and he was perhaps predicted by the Old Testament prophets. This is interesting. Number 9, his brother's name was James. We're going to come to James here in a minute. We know who James is, but there may be an artifact that actually we have found in Jerusalem that connects James with an archaeological artifact. And number 10, he was called Messiah by some. And of course, there are many other historical sources, which again, we don't have time to dive into, but just to give you a list of these sources, besides Josephus, we have Tacitus, another first century Roman historian, and then Suetonius, who was the secretary of an emperor named Hadrian in the 2nd century, who wrote a book called Lives of the Caesars. Pliny the Younger, Lucian Mara Berserapian, who was around the late 1st to 3rd century AD. This is from J. Warner Wallace's book, his Cold Case Christianity. He lists these other ancient testimony confirming the existence of Jesus. And some of these we already mentioned, such as Josephus, Suetonius, Pliny. He mentions another one called a guy by the name of Phlegon, Berserapian, and another one besides Tacitus is Thallus, who claims that Jesus lived, he was crucified, and that when he was crucified, there was darkness and an earthquake. Real quick on Tacitus, he is a fascinating character. I wrote a really to me, it's an interesting article because of this event. It's on my website. If you go to epicarcheology.org, go to blog. The title of the article is Tacitus and the Lost Legions of Varus. What is this and how is it connected to Jesus? Well, the point I try to make in the article is that Tacitus was actually a pretty darn good historian, and archaeologists have actually verified a really major event that happened in Rome and at about the year 9 AD. And we think that Jesus was probably a teenager when this happened. But essentially, a Roman general by the name of Varus lost 3 entire Roman legions, died. They all were brutally killed in this forest in Germany called the Teutoburg Forest. And so the article explores that event and the events of the life of Jesus. So check that out on our website, epicarcheology.org. But what are some things that we can learn from Tacitus about Christ? Well, the New Testament mentions several Caesars and, of course, Roman government officials by name and also in a particular order. A few of these are Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, the governors Cyrenius or Quirinius, Pontius Pilate, Felix, Festus, Sergius Paulus rather, and Gallio. And G.F. McClear, who was an old biblical scholar, essentially says that when you study classical history, the order that the New Testament has these rulers in are exactly the order that Tacitus has them in as well. So it's no small thing. I mean, you can say, well, of course, again, the Spider-Man fallacy people will say, well, of course, they might get a few things right. But one thing that was really interesting discovery that also confirms Josephus as a reliable historian is something that was discovered quite a few years ago. And in fact, in 1968, an Israeli archaeologist by the name of Benjamin Mazar, while he was excavating along the southern wall of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, they found this broken inscription, essentially declaring the place of trumpeting from the Temple Mount. And it was discussed, it had fallen from there, very likely in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. And this actually is connected to a quote. Here's the quote from the Jewish War, Book 4, in which Josephus describes a part of the temple. This is also in the New Testament as well. The point where it was custom for one of the priests to stand and give notice by sound of a trumpet in the afternoon of the approach and on the following of the close of every seventh day. So, in other words, when the Shabbat or when Sabbath was going on, the priest would stand on the corner of the temple and blow the trumpet. And this inscription actually shows us this title. Here's the artifact itself. It's you can see the Hebrew there. It's written in block Hebrew letters. It is currently in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and it says to the place of trumpeting. And this is what it would have looked like. This is an artist reconstruction of what that place would have looked like. Essentially, he's standing right there at a very, very high point of the temple. This trumpeting inscription is essentially, again, where the priest would blow the trumpet to announce the arrival of Shabbat. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. This is a quote here from one of the top archaeologists in the world on the Temple Mount, a Dutch archaeologist by the name of Leen Rittmeyer. And essentially, he believes that very likely when Charles Warren, who was an early explorer of Jerusalem, when he was digging down through this Temple Mount area, he likely broke off the other part of the inscription. And Leen Rittmeyer believes that the other part may still exist somewhere down in the southern wall. But this is a drawing of the stoa of the Temple Mount. And that little finger there is pointing to the place where that trumpeting inscription very likely was located. So again, to show Josephus is he's not making things up here. And this is a drawing of where it was discovered. Very important. So let me just move on here. The other thing about primary sources and historiography in the New Testament is something called verisimilitude, or a one-to-one correspondence. This is a quote from Roger Young. The Bible just doesn't contain chronological markers. It abounds in them. In other words, the Bible tells us where to look for certain events. It tells us it took place at this time when he was king and this person was ruling and whatever. And Young says there are 125 exact chronological markers for the 410 years from the first year of Solomon to the release of Jehoiachin from prison, plus numerous chronological clues of a more general nature. The precise markers include lengths of reign for the various monarchs, cross synchronizations between the two Hebrew kingdoms, and year synchronisms to Assyrian and Babylonian kings whose times of reign can be calculated from extra biblical sources. So what this means is that the Bible tells us when these certain events should have happened or should be taken. So let me give you an example. In Luke chapter 2, when Luke tells us when Jesus was born. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Quirinius was governing Syria. And so it's telling us, here is when it happened. And all went to be taxed, everyone to his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. Now, this doesn't sound like Luke is making this up. He's telling us when this event happened. He's giving us these chronological markers as to exactly when this happened. And of course, one of the major figures that figure largely into the birth narratives is Herod the Great. And let me just say, we could spend literally not hours, but days upon days discussing all the archaeological evidence for King Herod. This is one of about 15 palace fortresses that Herod built all throughout Israel. This one is called, the most famous one that everybody knows is Masada. But this one he named after himself. In fact, he was buried there according to Josephus. This is called Herodium. And Herodium, interestingly, overlooks the plain of Bethlehem. So where Jesus very likely was born, when Mary and Joseph were there out in the flocks, and they were staying with the shepherds in the little cradle there, they could very likely see the shadow and the lights from this palace built by Herod the Great. Um, so in 2007, this Israeli archaeologist named Ehud Netzer, he had spent 10 years looking for Herod's mausoleum at Herodium. And in 2007, he discovered the broken fragments. In fact, it's 99.9 is about sure as you can get in archaeology that this is the actual coffin of Herod the Great, discovered in 2007. In fact, I interviewed about 3 years ago one of the top New Testament archaeologists in the world, and this is not an exaggeration, Dr. Jody Magnus. Dr. Jody Magnus she's been on the History Channel a million times. She's brilliant. She teaches at UNC Chapel Hill. And I interviewed her for my YouTube channel. And Jody told me, in fact, she wrote an article on this, that she thinks that this discovery of King Herod's sarcophagus by Ehud Netzer is one of the top archaeological discoveries in Israel since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But it got overshadowed by some controversial stuff that came out on the History Channel. And she wrote an article about it. I think she's actually right. But it's over 8 feet long, and it's now in the museum in Jerusalem. And another person that figures into the Gospels is Pontius Pilate. Now, while we're talking about Herodium, in 1969, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem was excavating at Herodium, and they found this signet ring. Now, it actually, just to get a little backstory on this ring, it was actually taken to the archives in the Israel Antiquities Authority archives in Jerusalem. And it wasn't until just about 5 or 6 years ago until a doctoral student got it out and read the Latin inscription. And guess whose name was on the signet ring? Pontius Pilate. And it is an equestrian Roman ring with the name Pontius Pilate. And this discovery, this just seemingly throwaway discovery, links Pontius Pilate with Herod Antipas that's mentioned in Luke 23. When Jesus went on trial, Pilate actually had some interaction with Herod Antipas, and that's how they met. And so this signet ring being at Herodium is very likely because now there's this relationship between Antipas and Pontius Pilate. Now, gosh, there's so many rabbit trails, but let me just real quickly go through. So in what we call, archaeologists call the Second Temple period. So we're talking about 100 years or so before the New Testament, going all the way to about 70 AD. The Jews in Israel practiced, the Jews practiced several different things that they thought the law, the Torah, commanded them to do. Some of them were not anti-biblical, but they just probably reading too much into the law. But one of these was ritual purity, and they started using this burial technique in which it was the process is called oscilligium. It's a big word. Essentially, what it means is that there would be a second burial of the body. The body would be laid in the tomb in these little burial niches, and the body would decay for about a year or so. The family would then go in and take the bones, and they would place the bones in these ossuaries. That's where we get the word oscilligium. It literally means, the word oscilligium just literally means bone collecting. And so we know historically now, archaeologically, that the use of ossuaries, there is a beginning point and an ending point to the use of ossuaries. And they're seen to be primarily in the land of Israel, but there's quite a lot of the use of ossuaries in and around Jerusalem. And these are some of the ossuaries that are actually in the museum in Jerusalem. So let me tell you about some amazing ossuaries that we may actually have. One of them is actually the high priest who presided over the trial of Christ. His tomb and not only his tomb, but his family tomb was discovered in northern Jerusalem, or in the northern part of the city of Jerusalem. So this rock cut hewn with loculi, or kokim, as they're called in Hebrew, kokim, if you want to be really precise, uh, were typical of the Second Temple period in Jerusalem, that were discovered in 1990 in the course of the development of something called the Peace Forest in this neighborhood called Talpiot in the south of the old city. And so, anyway, the caption goes on to talk about these loculi contained. There were, I think, around. I got to look at my notes here. I think it's around 25 or so ossuaries in place, but only two of the ossuaries were what we called in situ, or in place, that were there 2,000 years ago. Some of them had been broken open. So this is not a great map. It's from a book that I have, but just to show you where this is in Jerusalem. So if you look at the very top of the photograph there, you see the old city of Jerusalem. And then if you get your, just look down and you see the Peace Forest, that is the neighborhood where this burial plot was actually discovered. And this photograph here shows three different angles. So the one on the top left is looking down. If you were a bird looking down at the tomb, then the one on the bottom below that is looking into the side of the tomb, and then the other one is also looking in the side of the tomb. And what was discovered there? A total of, it's 12, not 25. A total of 12 ossuaries were found in the tomb. 4 were found intact, but were not in situ, resting on the piles of other ossuaries, as well as a mixture of sherds and broken bones. But I want to cut to the chase here and tell you one of the ossuaries discovered. Here is a photograph taken before they excavated the material around them. They were all jumbled up. Not a great photograph. Again, it's from a book that I have on Jerusalem archaeology. But 2 ossuaries really stood out. And the one on the top was ornately carved. And the one on the bottom was also ornately carved as well. But it's the side inscription from the one on the top that is quite significant. Before I get to that, though, let me say one other thing that was discovered. Another discovery that was found was a skull of a woman. There was a coin from Agrippa the First from the year 6 found in a woman's skull. The skull was found in an ossuary inscribed with the name Miriam, daughter of Shimon. This is clear-cut evidence of the practice of a pagan custom that Romans were doing in the first century of actually placing a coin in the mouth of their deceased loved one as a payment for ferrying their soul across the river Styx. Now, why were Jews doing this? This another rabbit trail, but basically in the first century, and even before that, there was a big debate over among Jews as to how much Greco-Roman culture should they begin to practice. And many of these Jews, wealthy Jews in Jerusalem, were obviously practicing some of these Greco-Roman burial practices, as is the case. This is evidence of this. In fact, this is from Zvi Greenhut in the book Ancient Jerusalem Revealed. It is the first concrete evidence of the practice of a Jewish tomb in the Second Temple, Jerusalem. Hitherto, the only other possible example of the practice in a Jewish context was at Jericho. But here is the ossuary, and guess whose name was inscribed on the side? Yehoseph bar Caiapha. This is, in fact, again, discovered in 1990, and his bones, or the bones of a 60-year-old man, were discovered in the ossuary. So, guys, we could very well have, in fact, I think it's a pretty high degree of probability, we have got the bones of the man that Jesus stood before when he stood trial in the New Testament. These are his bones. You say, well, Ted, how do we know this is the same high priest? Well, because Josephus tells us his name. This is from the movie The Passion of the Christ. I'm not sure if his teeth look that bad, but you get the idea here. He slapped Christ and struck him when he was, of course, standing trial, and we have his bones. But Josephus tells us that his name was Yehoseph bar Caiapha. Josephus tells us his name. One other this is an observation that I have made about this. I'm currently teaching a class on Thursday nights on the archaeology of Jerusalem. One of the things that I noticed about the ossuary, and one of the things that I know from studying Second Temple Judaism, is that Jews in Jerusalem that were involved in the temple processes, they loved the temple. And I find it interesting that architecturally, there are architectural drawings or etchings on the ossuary that match what we see in Jerusalem going into the Temple Mount area. So if you notice here, the ceilings, these are actually have been some of them have actually been excavated by archaeologists, and these are from Leon Rittenmeyer's website. These are these geometric designs, but I want you to see how closely they resemble the designs on the ossuary. To me, reinforcing not that it needs it, but reinforcing that this is someone who is connected to the temple practices in Jerusalem. Because in fact, he may have actually hired someone who was a skilled artisan who maybe even carved some of these carvings in the Temple Mount to carve his sarcophagus, because many wealthy people would have their sarcophagus or their ossuary actually inscribed before they even died. So he could have had it done before he died, likely the case. This was discovered just recently in the past 4 or 5 years. Another example from this ornate architecture in the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This was discovered, I believe this was discovered, don't quote me on this, by Elliot Mazar, but she passed away a few years ago. I think this is one thing she discovered before she passed away. There's so much. This is one of the best drawings. I apologize for the line in the middle of it, again, from a book that I have. This is from Dr. Leon Rittenmeyer. But this is probably one of the closest views of what the Temple Mount looked like based on the archaeology. Now, this is the southwest corner of the Temple Mount, and what you see there, that little tuft of grass and those little blocks you see kind of on the side of the wall there. This is something called Robinson's Arch, named after the early biblical explorer and geographer, a guy by the name of Eli Robinson, or Edward Robinson and Eli Smith, that traveled together. But Edward Robinson in the 1830s, he was actually from Massachusetts, a seminary professor and geographer, identified this as an archway, and sure enough, he was correct. But just a few years ago, archaeologists working on something called the Temple Mount Sifting Project discovered these very ornate tiles. This is something called opus sectile. We know from other areas that Herod would use this. These are cut pieces of marble that are imported from different parts of the world. Some of the red or purple marble or porphyry very likely was imported from Egypt. And so there was an archaeologist working in the Temple Mount Sifting Project. She spent years, I think it was Frankie Snyder that did this. She is a colleague of some of my ABR colleagues in Israel right now, but she worked putting these together. And so the reason why I show you this is that this is what the floor of the temple looked like in the nicer areas. So what you're looking at is the floor, or at least what it very well looked like, of when Jesus was walking on the floor in the temple in Jerusalem. And we're pretty sure because we know this is that's what they would that's the kind of flooring that they would use. One other thing that was discovered in a sifting project is a golden bell, very likely that fell from one of the garments of the priest. So we know this was used as a temple. This is a kind of picture showing you how large, or how small the bell is. And I believe it was discovered by Eli Shukran, or at least he first identified this as a bell from one of the priest's garment. Most recent discovery, I want to mention this since we're already there at the Temple Mount Sifting Project, is something just recently that just came to light, just literally about 2 or 3 weeks ago. The seal of Yehada, son of Asiyahu, 3 weeks ago on the eve of the Jewish fast of the 17th of Tammuz, commemorating the breaching of Jerusalem's walls by the Babylonians, the mourning for the destruction of the first and second temples, archaeologist Mordecai Ehrlich discovered a rare and exceptionally well-preserved clay ceiling impressed by a stamp seal, inscribed with an ancient Hebrew letters. Basically, this person here is actually, there's the seal, and there's the archaeology discovery. See how small they are. This is a little clay. We call them bulla. It basically they are meant to seal documents, and it being found in Jerusalem actually mentions this person here, a figure described in the Hebrew Bible 2,600 years ago. This is during the time of King Josiah. So when King Josiah, you remember your Bible story, when he ordered the repairing of the temple in Jerusalem, during the repairs, the workers discovered the ancient Torah scroll and very likely the book of Deuteronomy, which told them they were sinning against God. And so the royal scribe read the scroll to King Josiah, and essentially, Josiah then dispatched trusted officials to seek counsel from the prophetess Huldah, who foretold that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed by the Babylonians. So, among Josiah's trusted envoys was a senior official with this name, Asiyahu. This is a theophoric name, which you can see at the very ending of that name is the term Yahu or Yahweh. So all of these ancient Hebrew names had a connection with Yah. So it's described as the king's servant. So given his prominent role, it's very reasonable to assume that his son may have also served in a prominent position either at that time or shortly thereafter. So the son of Asiyahu. So we have the son, the seal of the son of the man who was entrusted by King Josiah. That just recently came to light. But since we're already there and we're talking about Jesus, let me mention one other seal that was discovered by Elliot Mazar. This is the seal of the biblical king, the Judean king Hezekiah of Jerusalem. And the reason why I wanted to mention this, since we're talking about Jesus, is that there was a prophet that lived and prophesied during the time of Hezekiah who predicted Jesus 700 years before he was born. And this prophet was Isaiah. And we say, well, how do we know that Isaiah even existed? Well, the Bible, of course, says he did. And but we now have archaeological evidence for not only Hezekiah, but guess what? Isaiah. And just a few years later, after she found the Hezekiah bulla, Elliot Mazar discovered in her Ophel excavations the bulla of the prophet Isaiah. And this is pretty solid. This interpretation is pretty solid, and it's pretty widely accepted by scholars today, secular scholars as well. But if in which it's or since this is the prophet Isaiah's seal, this places the book of Isaiah firmly in the 8th century BC. Contrary to what skeptical scholars say, that Isaiah was written later, this firmly his roots Isaiah very early in this time period. In fact, I would argue that the events surrounding the reign of Ahaz and Hezekiah are some of the most well-attested archaeological stories that we have in the entire Bible put together. And we could spend hours just talking about Hezekiah and Isaiah. We're not. But here's another a picture of the Isaiah bulla that you can see there. On the left, the actual size is about 1 centimeter. So it's and if you're wondering what does this mean, Isaiah Nevi? Well, the Hebrew word Nevaim is the word prophet. So you may have heard of the Tanakh, TNK, the Torah, the Nevaim, and the Ketuvim. The law, the prophets, and the writings. That's where Nevi comes. So it's not Navy, it's Nevaim. So it's abbreviation of prophet. So belonging to Isaiah the prophet. What about crucifixion? What do we know about crucifixion? And I do realize we're getting kind of short on time, so I'm going to try to get through as much as I can. Well, we actually know quite a lot about crucifixion through Josephus and through archaeological sources. According to Josephus, he describes in the Jewish War some of the people that were crucified and how they're crucified. After the death of Herod the Great, 2,000 people were crucified by Quintilius Varus in and around Jerusalem. Ironically, the same Varus who lost his life in the Teutoburg forest that Tacitus writes about. When Josephus was besieged and finally, when Jerusalem was besieged and finally captured by Titus, he scourged and crucified nearly 500 people a day in hopes that more would surrender. When that did not work, he lined all the roads going into and out of Jerusalem with crucified inhabitants. In fact, Josephus says that they were stacked like cordwood, the bodies were on the side of the road. The practice of crucifixion, of course, was despised by the Jews. According to Deuteronomy, cursed is anyone who is hung on a tree. And then the Romans, of course, did not invent crucifixion, but they perfected it, in which it would have the most prolonged agony for the person being crucified. So, what do we know about crucifixion? Do we know for sure that it happened? Well, in 1968, another artifact came to light in Jerusalem in the neighborhood of Givat Ha-Mivar. The construction workers accidentally unearthed a first-century burial cave, and the archaeologist working for the IAA, Vasilios Tsaveras, they sent him to investigate and recover the artifacts. And according to Shimon Gibson, inside of one of the stone ossuaries, now you know what an ossuary is, the anthropologist Niku Haas found the bones of a 24 to 28-year-old crucified man mixed with the bones of a child. And they would do that. They would actually mix the bone. They would put whole families in the ossuary. And when the ossuary got full, they would put the bones under the niche where the ossuary was located. But the evidence consisted of a right heel bone with an iron nail firmly embedded in it. This was a unique find, and nothing like it has been found since. And here is the heel bone that has become known as the Yohanan heel bone. Again, and the inscription on the side of the ossuary says Yohanan, the son of Hakol. And this is the heel bone with the nail bent in it. And when they looked at the heel bone under it in a microscope, where to go? Let me go back. They actually found wood fragments, and the wood was, I think, if I remember correctly, you can look this up, but I think it was olive wood. Interestingly, from an olive tree. So in any case, Gibson says the crucified man met his death on some undetermined location or occasion in the first century, perhaps during the census revolt of 7 AD, or it could have been during the turbulent years leading up to the Jewish revolt in 70 AD. Now, one of the reasons why was the nail left in the heel bone? What Gibson says is because that was left because the executioners were unable to extract it from the dead man. So the common practice of the Romans were to reuse the nails for further executions. So when the nail was hammered into the wood, it seems like they probably hammered it into a knot in the olive wood, and it bent, and then it kind of got hooked and stayed in the man's foot. So in any case, one other ossuary I want to mention before we kind of wrap it up is the James ossuary. James, the brother of Jesus, is mentioned quite a few times in the New Testament, first as a skeptic of Jesus, and then he became a changed man, believing in Jesus as the Christ and leading the church in Jerusalem. In fact, both non-Christian sources and Christian sources tell us that James was killed for his faith on the authority of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. Josephus says that he was stoned, or that people and that people in Jerusalem were not happy about the decision about James being killed. But in any case, this ossuary actually came to light in the 70s. It was actually bought by a man by the name of Oded Golan in 2000. It was bought in the 70s by Golan, and he made it public in 2002 in Washington, D.C. With the Discovery Channel and Biblical Archaeology Society. And then went on tour, I think, in Canada. And then the Israel Antiquities Authority got involved, and they accused Golan of basically antiquities dealing and producing a forgery on the James ossuary. In 2012, the court acquitted Golan of a forgery because there was a photograph that surfaced of the actual ossuary in his apartment in the 1970s. And when he got it back, they actually they further analyzed the inscription, and it literally says on the ossuary, Yaakov, or James, the son of Joseph, get this, the brother of Jesus. So you rarely, in fact, you don't ever find on an ossuary. You usually have the son, son of whatever, but you don't have the brother. But the fact that this has the brother of Jesus on it, James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus, indicates this very likely. In fact, if you were to ask my opinion on this, I would say that this is very likely the ossuary of James, the half brother of Jesus. And again, further analysis on the conducted by the Geological Survey of Israel on the patina that is on the inscription itself indicates through micro artifact analysis that the ossuary is actually authentic. If you want a good book on this, check out the book by Herschel Shanks and Ben Witherington. In which they tell the whole story, the backstory, and also the epigrapher who first recognized it was a French epigrapher by the name of André Lamar, and he writes the foreword to the book. But that's a really good book. And by the way, to kind of give you a spoiler alert, both Shanks and Witherington also believe, as well as Dr. Craig Evans, another New Testament scholar who is an expert in Second Temple Judaism, they all believe that this is very likely authentic. So far, what do we have? We got Pilate's existence. We have James, the brother of Jesus. We have Caiaphas. We have King Herod. And this is we're just scratching the surface. We haven't even gotten to the book of Acts, but let me just real quickly for just a couple of minutes here, and then we'll wrap it up. This book, by the way, let me back up. This book here was written in 1990 by a Roman historian by the name of Colin Hemer, and he analyzed the book of Acts for its historical reliability and in its connection to the ancient Roman world. And sadly, Colin Hemer passed away before he could really get going. The book was published, but I believe this was his doctoral dissertation. And in the book, what he says, what Hemer really focuses on, is that there are three kinds of knowledge that are displayed in the book of Acts. Common knowledge, in other words, that everybody would know, then specialized knowledge that only someone who was there would know, and then specific local knowledge. And it's the specific local knowledge that give more authenticity to the book of Acts. So in other words, most Christians believe, most traditional scholars believe that Luke, the gospel writer who wrote the Gospel of Luke, also wrote the book of Acts, because he says in my former book, Theophilus, he's addressing this man named Theophilus. So if Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke and he also wrote the book of Acts, then we can surmise from this that he was a very careful, accurate historian. And what Hemer says with this specific local knowledge, these are things. For example, of course, as you know, I travel and I do archaeological research, and I've been to the work I'm doing now is in far eastern Turkey on the border of Iran. And it's an area that most tourists don't go to. Let me just say, most tourists in America go to the western part of Turkey, and they'll go to Ephesus, or they'll go to Greece or whatever. But there are certain things in eastern Turkey that you would not know unless you had been there. There are certain foods, certain restaurants. And here's the thing, Luke, who's writing the book of Luke, there's things that no one even knew he was right until archaeologists found these things. And there's just another list of things here: items of geographical detail, specialized details such as the titles of certain governors, army units, major routes. With the army units, he lists the certain units that were there. I know in Eastern Turkey, the unit that guards the border of Eastern Turkey is called Jandarma with a J, Jandarma, the Jandarma units. You would never known that unless you have actually been, because when you go to Eastern Turkey, you go through military checkpoints with these Jandarma units. In fact, it says Jandarma units on the army trucks. So, but Luke is showing the Roman world, there were certain units that were patrolling certain areas, major routes, boundaries, the titles of city magistrates, and the like. And then it goes on and on and on, and then undesigned coincidences between Acts and Paul's epistles. Gosh, we're out of time, but just to show you how much there is, Colin Hemer goes through every chapter, and there are, I think, 84 confirmed details of specifics. And what he says, just to give you an example here, the prominence of the Sadducees accords with a pre-70 setting for the Jewish revolt. So in other words, as a historian, when you're studying a historical document, you want, again, early attestation. And what he's saying there in Acts chapter 4, with the prominence of the Sadducees, is that Luke wrote the book of Acts very likely before the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So what that means is that's a early source. And it just goes on and on and on. But let me fast forward the thing here and give you a couple of artifacts here. One is this inscription called the Polytarch inscription, found in Greece and Thessaloniki. This is a specific title of a government authority called a polytarch. And Luke uses it correctly. It was not even known about until it was discovered in this inscription in the same place that is mentioned by Luke in Acts chapter 17, and it mentions the name of this polytarch. Another one is this guy named Sergius Paulus. Very likely refers to the same Sergius Paulus who was converted under the by the Apostle Paul in a place called Pisidian Antioch. There are two Antiochs in the New Testament. One is called Pisidian Antioch, and the other one is the Antioch on the Orontes. It's the Antioch where they were first called Christians down in Syria or Turkey. So anyway, again, just to say we're just touching the surface here. But to kind of summarize, we have, again, the three primary sources are eyewitnesses, historical records, which we look at the manuscripts, and we have archaeological evidence. And we are just skimming the surface, guys, of all of the archaeological evidence for the New Testament. So in conclusion, what I'd like to say is that to kind of paraphrase Dr. Daniel Wallace, when it comes to archaeology, we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the reliability of the New Testament. Now, have we found everything? No. But what we have found so far is an incredible track record of historical reliability again and again and again. And I'll say that many of these artifacts were discovered not by Christians setting out to prove the Bible. These were discovered by scholars just working in their respective fields in Turkey, in Greece, in Asia Minor, in in Syria, in Israel, in the West Bank, and again and again and again, these inscriptions and some of these things are discovered actually are people in the New Testament. So I think given this track record, I think it's safe to assume that as we go forward, we're just going to find more and more and more that's going to really reinforce the reliability of the New Testament. So I would say we have a very high degree of probability to trust that the New Testament is giving us reliable information about the story of Jesus, the existence of Jesus, and also the resurrection. Now, can it prove the resurrection? No. But it can show us that the New Testament is a reliable document giving us reliable historical information. Well, thank you so much, guys. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing. And
thank you so much. Really appreciate it. That was an embarrassment of riches right there.
Actually. Yeah. As I said, drinking from a fire hydrant.
Right. No, it's so encouraging. I mean, we do not, take this blind leap of faith into the dark. We have a historically rooted, grounded faith. These things happened in time, space, history, and all this evidence to support it. That's amazing.
Absolutely.
I know that specific local knowledge, like the undesigned coincidences, that's something Lydia McGrew has written about.
She has, yes.
Yeah. That book, the Book of Acts in the setting of the Hellenistic history, I'm very interested to look at that. Sounds very interesting.
It's a great book. And just so you know, it's not very cheap. But you can
okay.
If you find one online, you can
maybe Talbot, maybe Biola has it in their library. I can check it out.
Stocking stuffer for later, maybe.
Right. So ladies, we do not have time, obviously tonight, but if you have questions of Ted, where can they email you?
Absolutely. Please email me, it's Epic Archeology, one word, epicarcheology@gmail.com. And please send me any questions you have. You can also follow us on Facebook. We post a lot of things on Facebook. We're also on Instagram. I'm going to do a little bit better on Instagram, but my social media skills are mixed. But Facebook is really where we're strongest. And so we share a lot of really cool information, the latest discoveries. So you can check us out on Facebook, Epic Archeology on Facebook.
Outstanding. All right. We're going to say goodnight to you, Ted, and anybody who's interested in staying after he leaves, we are going to announce the book that we're going to be reading next and discussing next. Thank you again so much.
Thank you. It was an honor. Thank you. God bless.
All right. Well, for those of you who are new to Girls Talk Apologetics, or you've been away for a while and didn't see our announcement on social media, starting September 9th, we will be discussing Paul Gould's book, Cultural Apologetics. And if you are interested, you can just go to our website, girlstalkapologetics.com, and just click the link to sign up, and you'll get an email with all the pertinent information.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you for joining us, ladies. Good night.